Hi guys, as you can tell, the newest balance patch adjustment has just been released for epicseven, and I have to say, before we even get into it, this is a stupid amount of characters. I know they usually do roughly, I would say like a total of maybe like 6 to 8 characters total in terms of adjustments, but this is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 16, technically 20 total changes, which is absolutely ridiculous, including some system changes, which I'm kind of happy about, but we'll get into that in a second. Just to be clear, to run down what the characters that have been adjusted are, it's Ruele, Silverblade Aramintha, Last Rider Krau, Commander Pavel, Designer Lilibet, Twisted Eidolon Kayron, Melissa for the 11 quintrillionth time, Says, Elena for the 11 quintrillionth time, Mort, finally, Yulha, Blooming Lidica, Alots, which... okay, we'll get into that later, Peacemaker Furious, the actual lost child, Veronica, and Armin. Alongside that are changes to Cruel Mischief, RNL, Pure White Trust, and Hostess of the Banquet, in addition to the way that extra turns work. There's a lot to get into, guys. Let's get into it. So first and foremost, we have Ruele. And now Ruele has arguably one of the biggest changes and one of the most, I guess, like impactful changes of the entire patch. Because now, not only does she have a little bit, she still recovers health of all, well, she now recovers health of all allies as opposed to just one. But now she also provides a barrier and damage limit on her S2, which is absolutely ridiculous. That by itself is already kind of a game changer for Ruele, just because like barrier and damage limit to any character makes everyone basically Spirit Eye Celine. But now what she's given at the first starting turn is Spirit's Lord Protection, which upon receiving lethal damage, she revives with 50% health and increases CR by 50%. Does this kind of remind you of a Ravi? Because this kind of reminds me of a Ravi. And now, again, this is only specifically for herself, and that's fine, whatever. But now you have to kill Ruele twice, unless if you have Extinction, which, will change things up. Maybe Briar sees a little bit more play. But this is a very, very good-looking change, especially for players that have Ruele and haven't used her in ages. I can already imagine Ruele being used for slow players that want to use her in Arena or in Guild War. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Ruele used to be one of the GOATs when it came to Guild Wars long ago. And this is a change, I think, directly, specifically for that. And I can't really imagine how this doesn't end up being one of the best characters, not just for healing and slow players in Arena and Guild War, but also have some decent usage in RTA as well. I mean, damage limit, barrier, it's literally every time that you use your S2, right? Like what? Like you just have a full team of revivers that can't die? Ridiculous. Anyways, furthermore, now we have a buff to Silverblade Aramintha, and this is pretty insane. Now the way that the changes to Silverblade Aramintha are first that now she detonates. I believe she detonates now on her S1, which is cool. Now, basically though, like she applies a burn and then she detonates at the end of her turn, so not to be confused with like her detonating burns that are already there. She can apply and detonate at the exact same time, and she's also been given a huge stat increase with now her attack increasing proportional to effectiveness. Now this by itself is already really insane too, but then we have the combat readiness push of the caster, aka Silverblade Aramintha, being increased by 15% anytime an ally except for the caster ends their turn. Now, formerly, this was again a increase whenever an ally uses an AoE attack, and that's pretty much where characters like Rand and such kind of came into play and kind of synergized with Silverblade Aramintha, but no longer. Now, Rand, for instance, can S2 into S3, and she gets 30%, and honestly, he didn't even need to S3 if he didn't want to. Now, the other really big thing here is that she's now guaranteed 2 of her burn effects on S2, which is nice because, truth be told, Silverblade Aramintha was really scary in the past in terms of applying debuffs, but now that the game has evolved to a state where there's so many cleansers, so many debuffers, or sorry, anti-debuffers, and answers to characters like Silverblade Aramintha, this is kind of expected. She needed some love eventually, and I get it. You guys are probably maybe a little bit scared for this, but honestly, this is a definitely a change in the right direction for Silverblade Aramintha, especially because she sees no play whatsoever. But ultimately, it's just nice for her to get the free stats, both in combat readiness and effectively speed, basically, if you want to think about it that way, and the attack increase, so she can or basically fully commit to effectiveness builds. Now, the next character that we have is LRK, and this is probably going to be the character that I think a lot of players kind of overlook a little bit, and that's primarily because, well, LRK is kind of boring, right? He's an okay answer at times against certain knights or against certain AoE characters in general, but now when LRK uses his S3, he decreases skill cooldowns by 1 turn. Now, this is a little bit different than a character like, say, Laya, because she doesn't get necessarily affected by characters that reset. So in a sense, you will have to be like a little bit more careful about how resetting works in general. But assuming that you're just getting AoE'd by something, LRK, if I'm not mistaken, does end up being able to use his S3 anyways, and you know, the cooldown of his S3 decreases anytime he gets hit, if I'm not mistaken. Let me make sure. I'm pretty sure that's the way this works. Yeah, okay, yeah. Sorry. After suffering an attack that attacks all allies, or suffering an attack that targets all allies, he decreases his cooldown specifically by himself, which is really cool. So yeah, that's what I originally thought. If you're fighting against AoE characters, this should be fine. And if you fight against, let's say, ML Rwana, you should be able to AoE, but just be careful, because if there's ever an individual skill reset, this is not the case, and it's not quite the same as Laya. Okay, now, we have the next change coming to Commander Pavel, and Commander Pavel, I think this change is a little bit misdirected. Now, to be clear, I get it. Having Soulburn changed from being the skill cooldown, which was otherwise completely irrelevant and pointless, is a nice gesture, and honestly really nice for Commander Pavel players in general. But you have to understand that when it comes to changing Commander Pavel, this will not really change his effectiveness in any way, shape, or form. If you are someone that isn't somehow killing on S3, this is maybe only usable in certain cases where you're fighting against someone that has higher attack than you. Maybe if you're fighting against a Fire Ravi or something, this could be the case. However, most players that use Commander Pavel are either using him with a defense break, or they're using him with someone that can continue or clean up the fight. So although this is fine, I suspect that there will actually be a lot of players that end up skipping the Soulburn and saving their Soulburn on Commander Pavel for another utility character. Let's say a Peyra, if you're pairing Commander Pavel with Peyra. Like, the Soulburn on that character would be more impactful, probably in most cases, than Commander Pavel's additional damage S3. And just in general, I haven't really seen many characters survive a Commander Pavel if he's actually being picked in a meaningful way from either his S3 or his S2 combined total damage. So it's an adjustment, but honestly, not that huge of a difference. Unless if they change the multiplier by an insane amount. That could also be the case. Now, Designer Lilibet has another one of the interesting changes that have been introduced to her. And first off, she now has Defense Break on S1, which is cool. Like, honestly, much better. And I shouldn't say much better, because Silence definitely had its uses in some cases. But what I think is probably one of the second biggest changes that they had to her is the fact that now she increases not only herself, but all combat readiness of her allies by 15%. Formerly it wasn't herself, but now it's everyone's combat readiness push is increased by 15%. But that should not take your attention away from probably the most interesting change of all, which is penetrating target's defense by 50%. Now, again, this might not sound like much, because Designer Lilibet is, you know, formerly used to fight squishier targets or fight against debuffs, but you have to understand that when you start to add additional stats, similar to what Silverblade Aramintha was given prior to this, now you have a character that can afford to not focus on maybe something like crit damage, or even have to focus on maybe even defense so much, and can now afford to maybe go faster. Maybe she can build like more HP. Maybe she can do more damage through some other way and actually one-shot targets that otherwise had no business being one-shot, or she can use the additional stats to allocate more resources towards her tankiness. Now, that was the second biggest change, but I obviously forgoed the first, which is, or ignored the first, which is that now when she has her passive proc or has max fighting spirit, she gives herself defense buff, which is what she had originally, but she gives herself immunity as well. Now, if you are fighting as designer Lilibet against someone like Requiem Rwana, this doesn't really mean much to you, okay? That's just, truth be told, like, you're getting reset, it is what it is, okay? However, if you are fighting against someone that doesn't have as easy a time of, you know, resetting the designer Lilibet, or if you're fighting against just a general debuffer who doesn't have some way to reset designer Lilibet after, well, guess what? If you ran S2 into S3, or if you try to para S2, activate the designer Lilibet into Soulburn S1 onto the designer Lilibet after, you can't do that, because now if she activates her S2 at all, she gives herself immunity, and that's a really big deal. Now, I don't think that designer Lilibet is going to be really that impactful outside of what she was already strong in, but I think that just makes her a way more solid answer against characters that are trying to maneuver beyond what she's being picked into. Like, if you're playing someone like Para, and, you know, you're trying to get around some of the fighting spirit and the, you know, the resource bar that she has, I think this is what this was aimed towards. But I also think that designer Lilibet was likely buffed at the same time as Silverblade Aramintha, specifically so that you didn't have to deal with so much of the nonsense of, oh, well, like, what if Silverblade Aramintha just has 300 effectiveness now because you can just build her base speed, you run her triple hit set, and then she just stuns everyone? Well, maybe designer Lilibet has an answer to that. So to me, that's what this change looked like. They did reduce the damage a little bit of the S3, to be clear, but 50% defense pen is pretty crazy. Let's not understate that. Now, the next character that got buffed is Twisted Eidolon Kayron, and this set of changes is actually super impactful, I think, specifically for Kayron. Now, if you're fighting against someone like Abyssal Euphine, of course, the change to his passive, giving him 100% CR, still only gives him 50, which is fine, but 50% CR or 100% in guaranteeing the turn is super impactful for Kayron. Now, this is not without, you know, a need for additional changes, and if all it was, you know, an additional CR push, whatever. But now, even if you want to play Kayron with a bit of flexibility, you can, because now the base damage of Kayron's S3 is 5,000. 5,000, again, is not, you know, game warping amounts of damage, but 5,000 damage is probably enough in most cases to, you know, maybe one-shot a Spectre Tenebria that's hiding, finish off any character that's hiding after someone like Ran, or any AoE character applies damage, whoever it is, maybe after a candy salvo. Now you have Twisted Eidolon Kayron being able to do additional damage on his S3. And they also buffed the damage, the maximum of the total damage that you can do, which is now 15,000. And I mean, that guaranteed in most cases kills, you know, characters like Spectre Tenebria now, even if you're tanky. Now, this is fine, but I do want to mention that they did reduce the impact damage of this as well, and this seems to be the case across the board, where they'll add some new condition kind of damage, or they'll change the base damage of some characters, including, again, designer Lilibet and Twisted Eidolon Kayron, so they can add a new, more guaranteed, workable, more meaningful way to deal damage that has more counterplay. But I think in a net pot, or I think that for Twisted Eidolon Kayron specifically, the damage increases, the combat readiness push, and also the additional damage S1, which I'm assuming, like, the wording is a little bit different here. I think they just increased the damage of this, if I'm not mistaken. Or actually, I think it's just when you counter. Yeah, I don't think anything has effectively changed here. Like, between all the changes to Twisted Eidolon Kayron, I think this is a net positive and a huge buff. Huge fan of it. But we'll have to see, because honestly, with Harsetti and stuff, and all the New Moon Luna shenanigans, we'll see what ends up happening. But definitely a welcome and right change, or a change in the right direction when it comes to, honestly, one of the most forgotten Moonlights in the game. This next change that we have to Melissa is just an additional change, I believe, to her S2, which is fine. Additional damage is always fine. I don't even really know why Melissa is being buffed. I'm assuming maybe we're having a grass rift or something, or maybe there'll be some content in the future that has Melissa be changed. But also, or, well, Maybe it's because it's the vampire chapter. Who knows? Basically, this is kind of a null point kind of buff. It is nice that now she increases her own attack by 2 turns when she uses Blood Bloom. But again, between all these changes, I don't think Melissa is that impactful at all. You can use her, I guess, with maybe some of the other changes in the patch to maybe make her annoying with someone like Ruele. It's kind of a moot point, though. I don't think this character is amazing. Even as someone that honestly has tried to make Melissa work a lot, this is not very impressive. It's a nice gimme buff, I guess. Now, the next character we have is Sez. And the first thing that you guys might be familiar with when it comes to Sez is maybe a YDCB one-shot bomb compilation of Sez doing, you know, infinite damage and one-shotting T-Cern and stuff like that. But they've actually changed Sez in a very interesting way. Now, in addition to the additional damage that he's been given through, you know, some of his damage skills like Dark Shadow, what they actually changed now was that his Encroach can now only be activated, if I'm not mistaken, whenever an ally, except for the caster, attacks, and when the target that they're hitting is 30% or less health, and then that's when it activates Encroach. Now, even with its 3-turn cooldown, you might be wondering what the point of this is and why they shifted how Encroach works, but actually this is kind of funny because if you end up using Sez potentially as like an anti-cleave answer, or if you use him alongside maybe someone like Ed or against someone like Navy Captain Landy or Abyssal Yufine, it could be kind of funny to use him, number one, because he can't die in one hit. But if the Abyssal Yufine ends up getting someone like Ran really low, or if he ends up getting someone like the Ludwig really low, well, then Sez is going to follow up with an additional attack and also combat readiness push himself. And if you guys are familiar with most Sez builds, they're kind of built similarly to someone like T-Cern, or have T-Cern-esque level damage. But this could be a potentially really interesting one-shot and also deal with players that, again, are trying to play kind of high damagey because, again, just look at this. If you have any counters, he gains 30% CR. This is effectively what T-Cern does, but without having T-Cern needing to do her abilities. He just literally procs it as soon as the counterattack or any of the damage goes off against the enemy. We'll have to see how impactful this is, honestly, though, because I'm not too sure what the value of someone like Sez is as opposed to other characters like Abyssal Yufine, Senya, etc. that can anti-cleave better, but worth keeping an eye on. Let's move next to Elena, who also has received, I feel like, a ridiculous amount of changes at this point. This one I think does actually make sense though, because the EE that she had for her second option says that it dispelled 1 additional buff from all allies when using Eternally Shining Comet. And I think a lot of players, when they read this, thought to themselves, oh wow, like additional debuff, now like if I run like Doctor's Bag, maybe I can completely counter Ran. But that's not actually the case, because Eternally Shining Comet is her S3. But now what they did was they changed it so now her S2 dispels a buff from all allies using her S2. So this is kind of nice, especially if you pair Doctor's Bag alongside Consecrated Ground, which feels like what Elena was originally supposed to be to begin with. But I'm not too sure how much people are going to be playing all this AoE stuff, especially because it feels like Harsetti and stuff is changing things up. We'll have to see, though. More testing definitely has to be done. However, I think this change is very good for Elena. It's kind of what I imagine most players thought Elena should be doing to begin with, and thought Elena was, or thought how Elena was supposed to be played. Like, this just makes sense for her. Now, the next change, and I think, don't quote me on this, guys, but seriously, this might actually be the patch winner for like all changes, which is absolutely ridiculous. But we have to talk about Mort. Mort has now been introduced or buffed in a way where now he has an ignore resist basically built into his kit and all of his skills whenever he has max health higher than any enemy. Now, the main reason why this is impactful is, number one, because now he gets defense break, which is fine, but a defense break on a 50% chance, whatever. But Mort has basically been revamped in a major way. Now, first and foremost, he's immune to all debuffs, which prevent movement. Cool. He can't be slept. He can't be stunned. I don't know if this includes anything else. I'm losing, or this is you know, this is evading me off the top of my head, but that's not even the important thing, which is that now when you play Mort, all heroes except for the caster cannot counterattack. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword, number one, because if you have Mort and you're pairing him alongside counterattackers, presumably, unless if they've mistaken the wording on this, this means no one in the game can counterattack. Now, in addition to this, he still has the, you know, the counterattack and whatever he had formerly, and the additional or the 100% chance to activate Sacred Blessing. But they've also changed what Sacred Blessing does. Formerly, it used to give critical hit resistance to all allies and increase the speed of himself for 2 turns. But now it's been changed to give a skill nullifier to all allies while also giving him speed as well. This is pretty impactful, honestly, because being able to prevent damage dealt to your allies is definitely going to be more impactful than critical hit resistance in some cases, but I can see how maybe Sacred Blessing's critical hit resistance was nice if you were ever pairing someone like Mort alongside Candy, but honestly, you're not really going to be pairing him with Candy anymore anyways, because you can't do any of the counterattacking. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how Mort pans out. But the fact that no one in the game can counterattack when he's in it is pretty insane. This is literally like one of the tankiest characters in the game, honestly, in terms of base stats. And because he has all these additional stats and because he has so many free stats to work with for his kit, like he doesn't need any effectiveness. And because he basically has speed built into his kit, this is a really insane character to look out for. But we have to talk about the final thing, which is that despite the insanity of the additional buffs that he's been given on his S2, his S3 has also been changed to now include a new debuff called Fear. Now, you might be wondering what Fear does, and Fear says, cannot act for a certain number of turns. At the start of turn, has a 40% chance to be dispelled. Or dispelled. And, well, guys, I don't know. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this debuff before. But this sounds eerily similar to something like Stun, or if you guys have ever played like a game like Pokemon, it sounds to me like it's kind of similar to something like Confusion, or like when you're confused. I'm not a Pokemon expert, but that's the first thing that came to mind when I saw it, and it's a 2-turn Fear. Like, kind of ridiculous, and honestly, it sounds really crazy because, again, you know, this obviously doesn't apply to characters that have immunity, but if you're fighting against like late stage or against characters that don't have any immunity, or if you're able to strip off these things from allies, I mean, cannot act for a certain number of turns, and you have an annoying RNG thing where maybe there's a 40% chance for it to be dispelled. This is not only infuriating for the enemy team, but it'll probably also honestly be infuriating for Mort himself. But I do think that the additional penetration damage that he's been given on the S3 is huge, and it also ignores the resistance of any targets with max health lower than him, similar to, again, what he has on his S1. Now, they did change things around where now it has a longer cooldown, and also has more damage, and the amount of healing that you gain is increased. But I think that just between all the changes that they've given to Mort, this is looking to be one of the more interesting characters. Now, again, I think it's really hard to say right now what characters are going to be OP or super insane, just because Harsetti is changing so many things right now in terms of what can be picked. And although Harsetti does not, again, affect slow players necessarily, it does mean that, you know, for players that are trying to bob and weave in and out of, you know, their pick and ban phase, where they're sometimes trying to pick fast units or use knockwall, like Harsetti is affecting things in a meaningful way. And we'll have to see how this pans out. But I think Mort in general is probably going to be a character that can be picked in incoming weeks, I guess, like as soon as the balance patch comes out. I imagine that a lot of people are going to try to play this character, especially if you're dealing with all of the slow characters that are being introduced now because of Harsetti being picked. But in addition to this, we also have a change to his EE, which is that the buff duration of the speed increase on his S2 when he applies Sacred Blessing has also been increased by 1 turn. This is really impactful because now he's just going to be zooming potentially for up to, I believe, 3 turns. And great, but honestly, not the most insane thing ever. Now, Yulha has also been buffed, but after taking a look at it, honestly, it just looks like they kind of gave her additional damage, which is fine, but truth be told, Yulha was in most cases just used as bait for someone like Janua. I don't know to what extent the additional reflect damage will be impactful, but a lot of these changes seem like they just want to keep everyone in line with how much damage is being introduced into the game. And similar to someone like Commander Pavel, I don't see this changing her or moving her out of what she was already effective or strong in. So fine. Okay. Yulha's there. The next character we have to talk about is Blooming Lidica. And plain and simple, she's just been given a 50% defense pen. Cool. Honestly, this is super impactful. If you're just trying to, I guess, if you're trying to use her or make her more usable for multiple situations, this is nice just because she has an additional chance to be more effective, or she has a better chance of being effective in more scenarios. Formerly, if you tried to use her S3 against someone that was fast, you literally just did nothing. You did like literally 500 damage to it. So that's really nice now because at least you have 50% defense pen. But honestly, Blooming Lidica is not a bad character at all if you know what you're doing or if you're pairing her in correct situations. So I don't think that's like a huge, change to her, but it is nice It is a nice change for those of you that are trying to play her and use her for more versatile situations instead of just when you're able to land 8 debuffs. Now, this is where things get a little bit dicey because if you guys aren't familiar with it, ALOTs had formerly been introduced to a balance change way long ago. And effectively what they've, I guess, decided to change for ALOTs is now they're effectively gutting him in PvE. Now, if you're someone that needs to just use a character that has an attack buff, or if you want a character that gets an extra turn or one immediate turn, ALOTs is still going to be fine in PvE, but they've effectively removed all of his combat readiness manipulation with Spirit's Breath, and they've effectively removed its viability alongside it, unless if you are, I guess, really desperate. In general, though, this has been effectively, or the Spirit's Breath ALOTs combo has effectively been nerfed into the ground, and with it, they're giving us an Auxiliary LOTs recall. But we have to talk about this character's kit and then kind of my thoughts about this. So first and foremost, what they have now introduced is that his S2 has a 4-turn cooldown as opposed to 2, which is how now the Spirit's Breath interaction is nerfed and removed. But now what they've given is weak points to the ally that is being like combat readiness pushed with S2. And it also does generate 2 souls as opposed to 1. However, the additional change that they made to him is that now his S3 no longer silences for 2 turns with a 75% chance of proc. It is now a 80% chance of defense break. We need to talk about this though, because truth be told, or just based on what we're seeing right now, this is not a great change. No matter which way you spin it, unless if I'm mistaken, his soul burn, I get it. His soul burn allows him to defense break into increase combat readiness of an ally by 100% and then give weak points and attack increase. But this isn't a strip on S3, and ALOTs is one of the slower mages in the game. This isn't, Emma Luna, and if you're playing against Harsetti, this character has literally no use whatsoever, because, what are you going to do against Harsetti when she literally unbuffables you? But point is, most characters get countered by Harsetti, but this change to Auxiliary LOTs effectively does nothing for him. If you're someone that uses him in Arena or Guild War, potentially to maybe nuke someone with a blue or an ice Luna, that's one of the more common combos I used to see with Auxiliary LOTs. And otherwise, if you're trying to use Auxiliary LOTs for Hall of Trials, well, boom, this is gone as well. Now, if this was only designed specifically to change Auxiliary LOTs from being used in every single kind of Hall of Trials content, then I can at least understand where it's coming from. But understand that for anyone that, for whatever reason, enjoyed playing Auxiliary LOTs, this is kind of just a major nerf. Now, again, I just kind of want to read out what they said in here, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with, but this is what they justified the reasoning for this for. It reads, Auxiliary LOTs is being adjusted to reduce their effectiveness in PvE while enhancing its performance in PvP. Flat out, no one is going to be using ALOTs in PvP. But okay. The combination of Auxiliary LOTs short cooldown, mana injection, and Spirit's Breath artifact had created situations where its efficiency in specific content has become excessively high, making it difficult to control. I understand that. And in general, again, like, you can't really get out of dealing with or considering Alots plus Spirit's Breath, which, again, I understand this, but still, again, I'm going to hold off before I make any more comments, but I agree with this. As a result, we aim to adjust its usability in certain PvE content while allowing Alots to shine more in PvP. I literally have no idea what they're talking about here, because this is the second time that they've mentioned that they're enhancing his PvP presence, and I could be wrong, but at least from what I'm seeing right now, an 80% chance to defense break without a soul burn, ignore ER, and just giving weak points plus attack increase. Flan gives attack increase and crit damage buff, while like doing basically everything that auxiliary Lots does, and like it doesn't matter. So like what are we talking about? Right? Okay, let's continue on though. The cooldown of mana injection will be increased, but the amount of souls gained will also rise and will now grant allies exploiting weak points, allowing for more effective support of their attack capabilities. The effects that increase the attack and combat readiness will be removed. So furthermore, no attack but increase to himself, which is whatever. But they also removed his combat readiness push that it's like a 30% CR push formerly. Not the most insane thing ever, but still was kind of helpful. Let's move along. Desolation's effect, which previously silenced all enemies, will now be changed to decrease defense instead. If the additional turn from Soulburn is utilized, it will be possible to reduce the enemy's defense and immediately follow up with the mana injection to enable high attack allies to easily overwhelm the allies. Again, you can understand where they're coming from with this auxiliary Lots change, but like as with most things in epicseven, what sounds good on paper is not always good in practice. If you're fighting against literally any of the characters in epicseven right now, including Navy Captain Landy, you're dead, right? You don't have a way to strip them. You're probably going to get countered and die. If you're fighting against a character like maybe Abyssal Euphine, 50% CR instead of 100, and when you do the counter, you're dead. Now, I will say what this does introduce is something that is even more concerning in my opinion than any of the things that I just mentioned, which is you may be thinking to yourself, well, Connor, what if these characters don't kill you? What if the counter characters don't affect you? What if you can find a way for the counter characters not to ruin your day? And the answer is, you're just talking about Bloodblade Kayron. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, like I have my own thoughts about Bloodblade Kayron, but Bloodblade Kayron is not a fun character in like any sense of the word right now. Every single RTA match that I encounter right now has her in, and I get it. She wasn't even a character that was underutilized all the time. Like Bloodblade Kayron still had great potential whenever you were fighting against a cleaver that didn't have any strip. But now this is like just at best a Bloodblade Kayron buff, and at worst this is a character that is not going to be used, and they effectively just literally knife gutted auxiliary Lots for no reason. Now again, I shouldn't say no reason because I get it. Maybe it's really difficult to compensate for or make PvE content when you have someone that can always, every single turn, give you a guaranteed extra turn from a high attack unit. But what they decided to do to compensate for it makes no sense either. There is almost in no case or situation a better reason for you to pick auxiliary Lots over someone like Flan, over someone like Briar, or pretty much any character in the game currently. And this paired alongside some of the worst stats that you could honestly have for a mage relative to the other mages that exist right now kind of make him, at least in my opinion, one of the most bleh characters I've ever seen. It's not easy to make him fast, and if you do get outsped by auxiliary Lots, of course you're gonna die. But you could say the same with most other characters, like whoop-de-doo. Like if Flan has 350 speed, yes, she is the most broken character, I'm sure, in some cases too. But the compensation and them trying to say that this is a PvP buff, while just gutting his effectiveness in PvE almost entirely, feels a little bit unjustified and kind of feels like they need to maybe compensate for it a little bit more. Otherwise, I guess whatever. If we just don't care about auxiliary Lots, we don't care about auxiliary Lots. Who cares? Now, there is a recall for this, and although you guys may be saying like, oh my god, like recall, that's really pog. There aren't that many insane 4-star Moonlights, to be honest, nowadays, that you would be looking for. Now, let me preface that there are great Moonlight 4-stars, including like Angel of Light, you know, Moon Bunny, Infinite Horizon Acades, to name a few. But guys, we're in the middle of a 155-star, or we're in the middle of a 150 Moonlight pull event. And I don't really see how most players at this point probably haven't gotten all the 4-stars that you would already want, which is why, to me, like, I get it, the recall makes sense. That's what you would have to do, since they are definitely nerfing and gutting this character. But even the recall for this feels a little bit, I don't want to say tone deaf, but it feels like a little bit wasted, because I feel like we're in the middle of a period where most players are already being given a bunch of Moonlight 4-stars anyways. Again, there's not much you can do about this, because in my eyes, what they're just trying to do is just make it so that players don't have to deal with, you know, all the nonsense of PvE while having to cater to like auxiliary lots, or keep auxiliary lots in mind to begin with. But I don't know for sure if just because they decide to nerf Spirit's Breath and this interaction, if all PvE cheese has basically gone out the window. And I also want to say that this is kind of a dangerous like line of thinking, I think, for Smilegate, because effectively what they're saying is that if they ever feel like someone is too strong for PvE, or if someone is makes things too difficult for PvE, boom, we're just going to remove them. Now, I want to mention here, because they really haven't done nerfs to characters in epicseven really at all outside of Hua, and I guess technically this is an Alot's buff and nerf. But I also want to remind you guys that though it doesn't matter for auxiliary lots, because his artifacts were, you know, average or decent, and Spirit's Breath can still be used on someone like Angel of Light, similar to what happened with Hua Young. I'm not sure if any of you guys had decided to use bottles on, or if you guys had decided to commit to pulling for and upgrading something like Hua Young's Uberius Tooth. A lot of recalls like this, especially when there's really no good alternative or no good buff to compensate for them, feels a little bit off for players that have decided to commit to a character. And I get it, this is a very unique situation where they're recalling this, but I just want to like implore Smilegate, like, when you do these recalls, keep in mind that sometimes when you recall a character, the artifacts or the investment in the character is not just the character themselves, it's also towards the artifact. I bottled my Uberius Tooth 3 times because Hua Young was that OP, and we never got back like anything from Uberius Tooth. So maybe it was just me, maybe it was just like a small complaint, but if they end up recalling someone in the future and they only recall the hero, and you know, you ended up pulling for their artifact and maxing out their artifact, it also feels kind of bad and a little bit dishonest, because again, it's not just Hua Young that's being put out of commission, it's also her artifact, or, you know, the character and their artifact. Anyways, moving along, we have a change to Peacemaker Furious, and this character I almost forgot was even in the game too, but they have been kind of cooking with him. Basically what they have now is a guaranteed turn extra attack from the same skill when the caster is buffed on his turn, which is changed from the 40% chance that he originally had, and he'd have to soul burn otherwise. Now, the additional change that they have is now for Set in Motion, he not only increases his, or rather, all of his allies' speed and defense, or sorry, he not only increases the speed of all his allies, he now also gives defense to all of his allies as well. Now, they did remove Indomitable, and if I'm not mistaken, Indomitable gives you ER and defense, which is okay, I guess. Like, I didn't really see that many players really be able to effectively use Indomitable anyways, and most players weren't using this anyways to begin with. But now being able to soul burn this for an additional, you know, 3-turn speed and defense buff team wide does sound kind of interesting. However, I think what's most important here is honestly going to be the S3 defense pen. Now, formerly what it had was a condition where you had to have more defense than the enemy in order to actually penetrate up to 60%. But now you are able to just have the base 60% defense pen, which does make this more reliable. However, I want to say that in general, since this hasn't really changed how he scales or works, I'm not sure to what extent this character will still be used. But having I would guess, I think Indomitable's 25, roughly maybe a double increase in defense does seem kind of nice, but honestly, unless if they increase the damage of this S3, I don't really see this being a character that ends up being used anymore. And even from like what they describe in his little kit blurb, it just says that he has improvements in his stable usability, which is kind of cap, because who's using Peacemaker Furious? Anyways, whatever. Decent character maybe if you put a lot of investment into them, but I don't foresee him being super insane. Veronica has now been changed as well now, from formerly increasing the combat readiness of herself by 20% when there's an immortal ally or an immortal enemy on the opposite team, but now it's been increased to 50%. This is really big, because effectively you get a full turn if you take 2 turns. Now, I do think this is obviously supposed to be used against a character like Bloodblade Kayron. However, as I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, Bloodblade Kayron needs a little bit more finessing to actually remove her immortality that easily. What typically happens, and I think most players have probably experienced this, is you maybe get off like 1 immortality, or maybe you'll get close to activating the Bloodblade Kayron's S2 passive, but then you realize, oh, that's Senya that she's hiding behind. And then all of a sudden things get a little more difficult, or, you know, maybe the Bloodblade Kayron is tanky. And that's why I think things with Veronica are a little bit scary. But I think that honestly, the increased combat readiness push by 50% does end up being really nice. Just because this is more consistency in terms of when you're playing against immortal characters, and being given an extra turn, regardless of what she can do on that turn, is really nice, since the second that she takes that turn, she dispels immortality from all enemies. Really cool. It's basically a higher stability and usability buff, the same way that they did to Peacemaker Furious, but this is better wording for it, because this is definitely a more consistent buff to what Veronica was already doing. Armin has also been buffed now to increase the damage suffered from single target by 10%, but Armin is kind of a relic of the old ages. She's not really that impactful anymore. And that is all of the heroes from the changes. Wow, a lot. An insane patch, to be sure. But now they have also introduced some buff changes to the artifacts. And the first one is the Cruel Mischief, which now increases the damage, or sorry, the attack in Hall of Trials by 20 to 40%. Here's what I'm not entirely sure about. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think the change in attack, or the wording of this, could be a little bit dicey. I know that attack and damage increase is, or attack versus damage increase are 2 separate things. I don't know exactly when the attack or when attack or damage ends up being higher scaling, depending on who you're using. But I know that there are scenarios where sometimes one of them is higher than the other, or there's a more significant difference. But regardless, they're increasing the effectiveness of this artifact by potentially 10%, or it's going from 15 to 30 to 20 to 40. However, the major thing about this is that you can only use this 1 time per team, which is whatever. But the fact that this is being buffed, I think, is systematic, or is supposed to be indicative of their desire to make this artifact the go-to Hall of Trials artifact. Now, you might be wondering why I'm even saying that, because obviously this is one of the only artifacts in the game that is specifically catered to one kind of content. However, if I'm not mistaken, there was something recently with one of the, I believe it's one of the Hall of Trials chain or activities or challenges made, where rather than Cruel Mischief being the best in slot damage dealing artifact, players were using POS, which is a limited artifact, and players didn't have access to that, so technically they had an unfair advantage, or players that had the POS artifact had an unfair advantage and were unable to compete in the Hall of Trials at the highest level. Now, for most players that doesn't really matter, but in terms of a more fair competitive environment, that does actually matter. Like things like that, or not having access to certain characters that are limited, especially when things like pulls are at stake, is very impactful. And therefore, if that's what the change to Cruel Mischief is for, I'm all on board for it. And assuming that the attack increase is higher and better than the damage increase dealt from before, then cool. This is a great change. I think it does make sense to give access to all players to be able to compete in the Hall of Trials, assuming you dedicate enough time, resources, etc. into it, and you're not just waiting for a potential artifact in the future to return on a collab. Pure White Trust has also now been buffed, where now, if I'm not mistaken, almost every single class, I believe, now has access to some sort of soul generation. I could be wrong in this, but actually, I don't think knights have access to it. Knights and I think thieves may not have access to soul generation yet. Point being, this is now a soul generating warrior artifact. And to be honest, Pure White Trust formerly was very niche. Increasing crit damage and speed of the caster for 2 turns was at most usable on like someone like Lionheart Sirmia, but even Lionheart Sirmia would want to use something like Golden Rose or Portrait of the Savior, depending on what you're using. Now it giving 10 souls and having a 100% chance to increase crit damage of the caster for 2 turns is kind of interesting, but it's basically something that I would imagine players maybe use on Zahak, and I truthfully cannot think of another character who uses this artifact. Like, I've been going over it a couple times. I'm gonna look through one more time into the journal and see if I missed anyone. Warrior non-attack skill, warrior non-attack skill, warrior non-attack skill, warrior non-attack skill. Conqueror Lilius, I guess, technically speaking, could give herself souls, which could be impactful for a Soulburn S2. But outside of that, most characters, I think, can't really make use of this. But in that case, if you're going to use it on Zahak, or if you're going to use it on Conqueror Lilius just for the souls, that could be kind of interesting. However, again, both of them kind of, Zahak's not amazing right now. Most players will not see Aiden at all. Or if you do, players will just use, I don't know, like Shaltir, if you were here for the collab, to kill her instead. But the souls does end up being a little bit interesting for a Conqueror Lilius if you want souls on your team. Just keep in mind, though, that you are losing, Circus Fantasia or Proof of Valor or Sweet Miracle. What is it called? The Laya one, the Laya artifact, if you end up using this. But it is an option for you if you want souls. Interesting change. Now, RNL has also been buffed, but before we get into RNL, I'm going to talk about Hostess of the Banquet because the final change of the patch will tie in with RNL. Hostess of the Banquet has now been changed, where now when you're attacking, you increase damage by 5 to 10% at base, regardless of what the health total of the enemy is. But when the target's health is now 50% or more, you increase by an additional 4 to 8%. This is a change that has been introduced in a couple of artifacts, if I'm not mistaken, at this point. And the idea is that you want to, front load some of the damage from this artifact and not just make it where you have to be, only when you're at 50% health or only when you've reached this one specific condition can you gain value from this artifact. But now this does effectively buff Hostess of the Banquet much, much better, which is honestly nice if you're trying to play something like Bloodblade Kayron. But as I said earlier, I'm not a huge fan of Bloodblade Kayron. I think she is kind of cringe. But anyways, moving along, we have to talk about RNL. Now, the thing about RNL is that all it's been given is a 10% attack increase. And RNL is honestly not that bad of an artifact if you're pairing it with someone like Ran. Right? But I guess the justification for the for the buff to RNL is because they're effectively nerfing the way that RNL and extra turns in general work. Now, let's just read exactly what Smallgate wrote, and they say, currently the battle system in epicseven operates on a mechanism where if the additional turn effect occurs more than once in a single turn due to certain artifacts, all effects are stored and granted as stacked additional turns. While there are probabilities involved, this can sometimes lead to situations where the battle is excessively influenced, potentially causing frustration during battles. Therefore, we plan to revise the battle rules to prevent additional turns from being stacked. What the hell does that mean? Effectively, what this means is that when characters, you could just read it from here, the way that it works formally is that if extra turns occur twice or more in a single turn, extra turns will continue to occur in subsequent turns. Okay. What is now changed is that if extra turns occur twice or more in one single turn, only one extra turn will be applied and no extra turns will occur in subsequent turns. Now, effectively, what this means is that if you are playing someone like Ran, and if you decide to put Riel and Luciel RNL on your Ran, what you could do is you could press S2 on Ran, get the guaranteed extra turn because you decided to use his S2, but now you could S3 and have an additional stacked S1, and then have an additional stacked S1 after that, because you're effectively increasing the amount of turns or the chances for you to have extra turns in your kit, such that you could take S2 to S3 to S1 into S1 and basically kill any character that you want. Now, this is like one of the biggest memes in the epicseven community, because 2311 is like a ridiculous amount of turns being taken by a character that is 300 speed. Especially if you have access to souls, because you defense break someone and you're like a max damage thief. You can just S1 and then S1 and you have attack buff. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. And they wanted to make this less frustrating by nerfing the way that this works with RNL. And if I'm not mistaken, this should also change the way that this works on specifically Payra. Now, I have to be honest, as someone that has been really annoyed with the way that RNL works for years, not only because it's a very like low, it's not a low chance, but it is a lower chance win con in some cases. It feels like this is an artifact that never should have existed to begin with. An extra turn in general is already really RNG, or very impactful, I should say. So making it RNG and having the potential for you to have like 8 extra turns that you otherwise wouldn't have had access to in the span of a fight feels really annoying. But specifically for Rand, because he is so fast and has so many like impactful abilities in his kit, it feels like RNL was just not meant to work with him. And again, I get it. Some players will definitely be annoyed with the fact that, like, oh my god, all I can do is S2 into S3 into S1. Or, well, I mean, formerly, like, what you were able to do was like S2, S3, S1, and then have the additional S1. Like, if you're someone that wanted to abuse the 2-3-1-1 kind of mechanic, just understand that, like, it's frustrating to fight against, because the odds of that happening are not supposed to be that high. And banking for that as your win condition is like, what are we doing? You know what I mean? And I get it. As someone that has both used RNL and also lost with RNL, it's one of these artifacts that feels like when it's on the enemy opponent, the RNL is proccing 30 times and you can't believe it. But when it's on your team, I've never had access to RNL. RNL, do I have to re-equip my artifact again? I swear RNL is not working. There must be a bug. And because that's the case, it really does feel like RNL as an artifact or as a concept really doesn't like it. Like, it's such a such a polarizing artifact. I don't even know if I'm using that word right, but it feels like it has such high highs and such low lows that I get it. It's supposed to be a gambling artifact, but more often than not, like, just having it in a match just feels so frustrating and so miserable, where I feel like most players are already swapping off of, like, you know, something like RNL on their rants, and they're using damage artifacts like Symbol of Unity or a Sword of Summer Twilight instead. Therefore, I feel like although this artifact is kind of impactful, and it did give you more of the Gamba sense, it is definitely really frustrating. And as a result, however, regardless if you enjoy or you hate RNL, personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. They're giving you a recall of it. And this is kind of nice because, again, RNL is a 5-star artifact, and getting access to more artifacts is always really nice. But it's funny because this also applies to Butterfly Mandolin, which is like the other 3-star that most people didn't realize also had this effect, and most players don't even know what Butterfly Mandolin is. But it does give you, again, the opportunity to pick other 3-star artifacts if you want them. But guys, that was the balance patch. I just want to go over really quickly what I thought were, again, the winners of the patch. I think by far Ruele, Mort, and I'd say probably Kayron are likely going to be the characters that see the most play. Some other changes were really nice, like usability changes to Veronica, Elena. Like, these are really nice too. Overall, I would say that the characters that they targeted and their changes in general were really, really nice, honestly. Probably just in terms of characters alone, it's definitely an 8 out of 5 or 9 out of 8.5 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 patch for me specifically. However, I think that the battle system changes and the artifact changes were also really nice too. But I have to say that because of the way that they're treating and, again, like, really handling this whole, like, auxiliary lots change, like, I hope they don't do something really goofy and stupid in the future, similar to this. But, like, honestly, them changing auxiliary lots and then, like, their proposed PvP change to make him, like, slightly better is, like, probably one of the most punishable kits of all time, or it benefits literally only Bloodblade Kayron, who in my opinion is a really kind of like toxic feeling character right now. Feels like this makes the patch die a little bit for me, just because like I guess I have a bit of a soft spot for playing auxiliary lots, and they basically just gutted my boy. But overall, I definitely think this is like by far one of the best changes that are best patches that Smilegate has done. There's so many characters that have been changed, and honestly, I'm for it. I'm a huge fan of it. I'm excited to see what they do next. Hopefully they don't include more auxiliary lots looking changes to the game, and they introduce more changes like, you know, Mort changes. That's kind of a cool change. I also really like Ruel's changes. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this video. I apologize again. This one's going to be a long one. There's definitely some rambling. I try to be as concise and give you like a better idea of what I was thinking of from this video. But as always, it's really early and we're just taking a look at the buffs. There's definitely going to be some incorrect information here, so please don't gut me for it. But insane changes. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you all next time. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.